The Ninja Gaiden series is a long-running series with an NES trilogy, an Xbox trilogy, Game Boy and arcade games, a Ninja Gaiden X and Z, and having the main character of the series, Ryu, appear in Dead or Alive, among other games. It becomes rather hard to follow the chronology, but in this video, we're going to try and get to the bottom of the chronology of this series. For this, we won't be discussing the non-Tecmo involved games, nor will we include the live-action movie. Okay, we'll generally go in order of the game's releases and work out our timeline from there. First up, we have the 1988 release of the original Ninja Gaiden on the arcade. This game's story seems to take place in 1999, which we will soon find out is over 10 years after the first NES games. Now, the weird thing about this is that the main character in the arcade game isn't even necessarily said to be Ryu Hayabusa, but generally fans assume that that is who he is. Okay, next is the original NES trilogy, which we will call Ninja Gaiden to avoid confusion later with Ninja Gaiden. First, we have Gaiden 1, which, according to the third game's manual, had taken place in the summer of 1988, quite some time before the previous game. Next, we have Gaiden 2, which, in both the manual and the game itself, is said to take place 1 year after the previous game. This means Gaiden 2 would be in the summer of 1989. Gaiden 3 now, after the credits, is stated to be before Gaiden 2, and is perhaps one of the first games to have done this, having 3 come before 2 in the timeline. It's more common nowadays with games like Metal Gear Solid and Devil May Cry, but this was probably the first. Now, I've seen sources claiming that it's exactly 6 months after the first game, but I've not been able to confirm this with the manual or anything else. But either way, it is taking place after the original Gaiden on the Nintendo Entertainment System, so let's just assume that it takes place near the beginning of 1989. Next, we have the Gaiden OVA, which, according to Robert's dialogue, seems to imply that it takes shortly after Gaiden 2. Since it was only summer in Gaiden 2, I think it's safe to say that this also takes place in the same year, 1989. Also around this time, Ryu is running an antique shop with Irene, which will also be information we might want to refer to later. Next, we have Gaiden Game Boy, commonly known as Ninja Gaiden Shadow. As in the manual, the game takes place 3 years before the first Gaiden, making it currently the first in our chronology at 1985. Let's stop here and take a look at our current timeline. So far, it's not overly complicated, and we have rough dates to back up the chronology for most of the installments. Following this, we have Ryu and other to-be Ninja Gaiden characters appearing in the Dead or Alive series. Ryu is stated to be 23 years old, and Ayane is stated to be 16 years old. These ages will come in handy later. From Dead or Alive 1 through 4, and the Extreme games, none of the characters seem to age at all despite all having birthdays in various months. This seems to imply that these games generally take place around the exact same time, maybe days or weeks apart even. We won't go into details of these games, so we'll just add them into the timeline and put them in the order based on the events that occur in those games. Also, just to get it out of the way, in the Extreme 2 remake, Paradise, there's the character Rio from the Rio series also included. This may be a simple cameo, but just to put it into the timeline for the sake of completion, Rio is a 19-year-old girl who claims to be 21 in order to work at a casino. Her profile also says she's 21. It should be safe to assume that the entire series would take place around the same time as the Dead or Alive games. So let's just put it in before 4, but there really is no exact placement for this game. One other thing that I think needs to be mentioned here is that Ryu seems to work at an antique shop with Irene, which would place the Dead or Alive games after the Gaiden games. Although we don't have an exact date yet to determine exactly how long after, we can place it as early as possible, being somewhere around the summer or after the summer of 1989. So for now, let's place them there, after the Gaiden OVA. Let's take another quick look at the current timelines, just to show the order of the Dead or Alive games as well. Okay, now here's where the timeline begins to get tricky. In 2004, the Ninja Gaiden series was revamped, and from then was called Ninja Gaiden in Japan as well. Many people believe that this was a complete reboot of the original games, and they could no longer have happened. However, several interviews seem to imply that Ninja Gaiden was a prequel to Gaiden. We also heard in interviews that Ninja Gaiden takes place approximately 2 years before Dead or Alive, on top of which Ayane is stated to be 14 years old in Ninja Gaiden. Also, in the same interview, Ryu is said to be 20 and not 21. This might have just been a mistake, or perhaps the Dead or Alive games take place between June and August, whereas the first Ninja Gaiden is at the beginning of the year. Because in the Game Boy game, Ryu had apparently not mastered any Ninpo aside from the art of the Fire Wheel, it should probably be safe to say that Ninja Gaiden is after the Game Boy game, but before Ryukenden 1. Before moving on, we should also cover the other brand new Ninja Gaiden to come out in 2004, Ninja Gaiden X. As a game, there's nothing special about this, but it's Ryu's final test as a ninja. Once you complete the game, Joe Hayabusa, Ryu's father, tells Ryu that he is going to go and defeat Jakio, and the ending shows that the game continues in Ryukenden 1. This also helps further the idea that the Ninja Gaiden series still consists of the Ryukenden series. This game seems to take place right before Ryukenden 1, so we'll place it in 1988. Next, we have Ninja Gaiden Dragon Sword, which is stated to be taking place half a year after Ninja Gaiden. Still no exact date, but with the information seeming to imply that the first Ninja Gaiden is at the beginning of the year, Dragon Sword is probably in that same year. The next two games, Ninja Gaiden 2 and Ninja Gaiden 3, I have not found any manuals or guides so far showing exactly when they take place, but according to various net sources, Ninja Gaiden 2 is nearly half a year after Dragon Sword, and Ninja Gaiden 3 is apparently taking place several months after 2. Of course, during the game there are several scenes which show us 3 is definitely after 2, and 2 is definitely after Dragon Sword. If anyone knows the exact sources stating how long each of these games is after the previous game, please let me know in the comments. Also, we are given a motion comic known as The Vampire War, which is a prequel to Ninja Gaiden 2 and comes between Dragon Sword and 2. Now, considering our current timeline, the Ninja Gaiden games have to be before Ryukenden. We can safely say that despite the seemingly advanced technology in the games, they have to be somewhere between 1985 and 1988 before summer. However, we know that the Dead or Alive games are approximately 2 years after the first Ninja Gaiden, which would mean the first Ninja Gaiden would most likely be at the beginning of 1987. Even assuming it comes near the very beginning of 1987, we could only put up to Ninja Gaiden 2 in this year. Everything else would fall into 1988 before summer. Okay, let's take one more look at what we have so far before moving on. Then we have Musou Orochi 2, or Warriors Orochi 3. Now, generally, cameo appearances don't necessarily have to be put anywhere in a timeline, like Link and Smash Brothers, but according to interviews, Ryu from shortly before Ninja Gaiden 3 is warped into this world, so let's just put it after 2 and before 3. Back to Dead Alive, we have Dead Alive 5, which is set 2 years after the previous Dead Alive games, making Ryu 25 in them. However, this 2-year gap was probably just to avoid future controversy regarding under-18 characters such as Ayane and Kasumi. Again, assuming everything to this point to be true, this would make the game set some time between June and August of 1991. Next, according to interviews, Yaiba Ninja Gaiden Z is shortly after Ninja Gaiden 3. Considering we're already into 1988, it would probably be very shortly after 3. Now, we also have the Ninja Gaiden Z comics. The first of the 3 parts of the comic illustrated Yaiba's past, and something that must have happened in 1985 or before, because the second part of the comic, Yaiba claims he hadn't gone back to that certain village in years. Since 1985 is the current start of our timeline, we shall put it there for the time being. The other parts of the comic seem to lead directly into the events right before Yaiba, so putting the next 2 parts of the comic right before Yaiba seem to be no problem. Finally, if you want to include them, other games where Ryu and Ayane appear are Shin Sangoku Musou or Dynasty Warriors, Multi-Raid, and Versus. In both games, Ryu will appear as somewhat of a character, with what some might call a story, but nothing that would really affect the timeline in any way. If I had to guess, I would probably put them in the same area where Ryu is already crossing space and time with Orochi 2, but, however, we'll leave them out of this timeline. Now, let's take a look at what we have now. Well, this concludes our current Ninja Gaiden timeline, as there's nothing more that we can really put in right now until Ninja Gaiden 4 comes out anyway. And if we are to assume that the arcade game's main character was Ryu, this would have the whole series having Ryu's story spanning from the ages of 18 or 19 to 33. The only big problem I can see is that if the next Ninja Gaiden game is also supposed to be before Ryukenden and after the other Ninja Gaiden games, we're definitely running out of space to put it in.